on the agenda this morning. To my further left is Mr. Elliott, who is our legal advisor this morning, and then further to his left I have Mr. Williams and Ms. Guild from Committee Services. And usually this morning we have two members of Committee Services with us. I'll explain that a little bit later on. Members, could I ask, first of all, do we have any declarations of interest this morning? Councillor Anderson.
None.
Thank you. Councillor James.
None for me, Convener, thanks.
Thank you. Members, are we happy to agree the minutes of the local review body of the 5th of April?
Agreed. Agreed.
Thank you very much. And with that, we will then move on to the first item, which is item 4.1, the erection of a dwelling house, land 50 metres southwest of Leland Stables, Moorcars Crossroads. And I'll ask Mr. Burton if you would introduce the application.
Right, sorry, that's it now. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, thank you. I don't know what happened there. I seemed to join as a guest and I wasn't in control of the mic, and then all of a sudden I was. Okay, right. So I'm glad I'm back. Thank you, Chair. The first case, Moorcars Crossroads. The applicant, this is for the erection of a dwelling house 50 metres southwest of Leyland Stables at Moorcars Crossroads. The applicant seeks to replace the mobile home, which is on site, with a permanent dwelling house, 1.5 stories high with 4 bedrooms, a kitchen, dining room and lounge. No change is proposed to the access, which as shown in the photographs is well established. I wonder, could you put the photographs on for me, Audrey? Right, the first one is a slightly blurry one, showing the location in a wider sense. You can see ringed in red the white buildings which make up the stable block. The mobile home is just to the north of that. Next picture, please. So the application site is north of the stable block. The stable block and the land to the south of that are both owned by the applicant. And you can see there's quite a long access along from the A91, which has been planted, fenced, and I think is shown in the next photograph. So the access road is quite pleasant. It's quite well established. Next picture, please. And you can see it has all the appearance of an established access to a site. Next picture, please. That's looking back from the site along the access. Next picture, please. And that's the mobile home that's on site. You can see just beyond the mobile home there's a high hedge that marks the boundary of the site. The fence to the rear of it marks the boundary of the site to the other direction. And you can see that it's mostly laid with gravel. The white building you can see just beyond the white van, that is a stable block, which the applicant also owns. Next picture, please. Very closely, you can see the garden attached to the mobile home in this one. While the mobile home does have the appearance of a bungalow, it's still a caravan in terms of the Caravan Act, and it is in fact a mobile home. Next picture, please. Just another view of the mobile home, which has, as you see, has stone steps and railings leading up to it. Next picture. And that shows looking south into the stable area. Sorry, that's from the south, not looking back, looking towards the house from the stable area. So that the boundary for the application site is the end of the tarmac, basically. Next picture, please. Oh, that's it. So if we could go back to the second, the second picture showing the application site, please. Right, thank you. Now, the other thing that's relevant is part of the site is traversed by a high pressure gas pipeline to the site, and the site of the house is within the consultation zone. Health and Safety Executive, the relevant authority, do not advise against the granting of planning permission on safety grounds. So the reason for refusal is the application is contrary to policy 19 of the housing in the countryside, policy 19, which is housing in the countryside, Perth and Kinross Local Development Plan 2019. The applicant's case, to summarise, since the application was submitted, planning permission has been granted for dwellings to the west of the application site, which means that the proposal should be viewed as part of a building group, which would make it acceptable in policy terms. The site is occupied by a mobile home, technically a caravan, and replacing it with a permanent dwelling would improve the appearance of this part of the countryside. The proposal would not alter the use of the site. To summarise the report of handling, the application site is located in the countryside as defined in the local development plan. Supplementary guidance, which supports policy 19, housing in the countryside, has a list of categories under which the council will support proposals for single houses in the countryside. The first one is building groups, and that is a new house which would form part of a building group could be acceptable in terms of the policy. Second one is infill sites, which this site is not, and the third one is new houses of defined categories of sites. This doesn't fall within any of the defined categories. Renovation or replacement of houses, that is the conversion or replacement of redundant non-domestic buildings, which this is not, and development on brownfield land, again, which this is not. It doesn't fall within that category either. The only categories considered to be relevant are number 1, building groups, and number 4, replacement. 1 to 3 or more buildings which appear as a group with a site adjacent to that, which would extend that group, can be acceptable. The buildings on and adjacent to the application site are not considered to form a group in terms of the policy. And number 4, the renovation or replacement of houses, this category does not apply to the replacement of caravans. So the proposal is therefore taken to be contrary to policy 19 of the local development plan. There were no public representations received, no objections from internal or external consultees. It's noted that the education part of the council, education service, has made the point that if permission is granted, a contribution towards education of £5,164 would be required. So turning to material considerations, policy 19 of the Perth and Kinross Local Development Plan is the correct policy against which the application requires to be assessed. The proposal does not meet the terms of categories 1 and 3 of the supplementary guidance which accompanies this policy. The fact that if you look at the application site boundary on the photograph on your screen, 4 houses have been granted in the field immediately to the west, which is further along the A91. Basically, the site is on the corner of the B9, the minor road and A91, and extends about half of the site towards the actual application site. There's a gap of about 40 metres between the edge of the application site and the boundary of the closest house. So it cannot be considered to form part of that building group. In addition to this, planning permission was granted in 2011, but that consent has not been implemented as far as I could see. I haven't been able to ascertain whether works have been carried out on site, which mean that the consent remains live. It could remain live, but it's not something I've been able to find out. There is some evidence on Google Street View that works took place within the appropriate that took place, which could have been within the appropriate timescale to at least demolish the village. The cottage, but that is in itself isn't enough to make the consent extant. The kind of building works that are required would be forming an access into the site, or taking our operations to form a foundation of one of the buildings that have been granted. I haven't been able to ascertain whether any of that has taken place, but in any case, the boundary of that site, as I said, is roughly 40 metres from the boundary of this application site, which means that it does not, as the handling report states, form part of that building group, or it could not form part of that building group if the building group were to be there. That's all, but I'm happy to take any further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. Councillor James, any questions?
Thanks, convener. Sorry, Mr. Burton. Did I just misunderstand or mishear? You said there's extant permission. Is that on this site or the one
No.
to the west?
It's the site to the west, which the appellant has mentioned. I haven't been able to ascertain whether it is extant. If some building works took place within the time, the appropriate timescale, 3 years of 2011, which are enabling works, or which are works which are required for the consent, then it will be extant. If there weren't such works, then that consent has lapsed.
Councillor Anderson.
Yes, a quick one. There's still, even if this permission is granted, there's still outstanding permission for 2 caravans on the site as well. Is that correct?
That's correct, Councillor. The consent which allowed the existing mobile home to be on site was for 2 caravans, although clearly there's only one on site at the moment. So that would remain if this application is granted.
Thank you.
Just one question, Mr. Burton. We're talking about the site where there has planning permission already on it. Do we know how many houses were allowed for that site? I know you said they're 40 metres away from the site, but do we know how many were actually planned on there?
Yeah, 4 houses.
4. Okay, thank you. So, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor James.
No, I'm happy with the information we've got, convener. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm of the same opinion as well. So we're now in a position to move to debate. Can I ask you, Councillor James, having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, Perth and Kinross local development plan, and all other relevant material planning considerations, to start, please?
Thanks, convener. Audio. Looking at this initially, I thought it was pretty straightforward, and my heart would have ruled my head. However, this is a site with permission for 2 caravans, and we're replacing a caravan with a house, or the request is to replace a caravan with a house. You could end up then with a house and 2 caravans, and have we then opened up the gate, because this is quite a large site, for more development, which I don't think would be suitable. I'm minded to agree with the officers on this occasion, and would refuse the appeal. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor James. Councillor Anderson.
I would agree with the officers.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. My thoughts, obviously, the majority is already there anyway, but I have to concur with Councillor James, I think, on this occasion, and would concur with the officers for the reasons for refusal. Thank you very much. Mr. Elliott, anything to comment on there?
Nothing to really add, Convener. I think it's been quite clear. I'm directing you to page 35, which is the additional grounds of refusal. I've not heard anything to suggest any change to the terms of refusal, so it's a straightforward refusal in line with the original grounds of refusal that you have before you.
Thank you. Hopefully that's back on again. The application is therefore refused. We will move on now to 4.2, and again I'll ask Mr. Burton to introduce the application.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, the application is for the demolition of existing extensions and erection of a new extension at a semi-detached cottage on a rural road to the south side, on the south side of Loch Tay. I'll run you through the pictures first, which I hope will help in come to a decision. Again, there's a red ring and a very bloody site visit site plan, just to show the application site in context. It's at the edge of a very small hamlet along the single track road which runs along the side of Loch Tay. And we could take the next picture, please. You can see that the boundary of the site is slightly strange in that the next door house seems to back onto their garden. The strange layout of or the unusual layout of the houses. The house, which is the subject of the application, has a garden which extends a few meters beyond the rear of the neighbouring house. Next slide, please. Here we are. Now this is looking down the road from just opposite the gate of the entrance of the site. You can see one of the houses in the hamlet, and just to the south there. Next, and you can see also the road rises quite significantly as it approaches the house. Next slide, please. That's the application site, or the application property rather, and you can see the difference between the two houses. The application property has got a higher eaves than the adjacent one. The application property has the two dormers and the front porch. You can see the adjacent property, the other part of the semi-detached, has no dormers. So you can see the gable of the house. As you get closer to the house, you can briefly catch a glimpse of what's behind it. Next slide, please. There's a brief part of the road which gives you a view of the rear garden of the application property. Now, the proposed extension the corner of the proposed extension would be slightly visible from this. You would be aware of it as you pass. It's a very small part of the road. It's perhaps 10 meters of the road. So it's the rear extension would not be hugely noticeable, I have to say, from the public road. Next slide, please. Going into the property itself, the gable and the back and the rear garden. This shows how the outlook to Loch Tay and a little bit of the rear. The next slide shows the existing extension. Next slide, please. Yeah, right. So the existing extension is shown here. A lean-to conservatory, and what you can also see here is beyond that conservatory, the hedge which marks the boundary with the neighbouring property. As you can see, it's some distance away. It's something like 7.5 meters from from the edge of the proposed extension. If we perhaps just leave that slide on, I think that's possibly the most helpful one. The applicants, to summarise the applicant's case, the appeal property has an existing conservatory extension which is to be removed. The proposed extension has been designed to blend better with the house than the existing extension does, contributing positively to the quality of the surrounding built environment. The first reason for refusal cites policy 1B of the LDP, pardon me, which is a placemaking policy intended to regulate wider development issues and not a route extension to a house. It would be more appropriate to use the design guidance in the supplementary placemaking guide, Householder Extensions. That guide speaks of an extension which is purposefully different from the design of the main house, but complementary and compatible. This is the design aesthetic employed in the application. The second reason for refusal is overlooking. A window in the southwestern elevation would, it is claimed, give a clear view into the neighbour's garden. This is a misreading of the plans. The window in question would lead directly into the applicant's own garden towards a boundary hedge 7.5 metres from the window. This boundary screening could be augmented if required, but is considered to be adequate. The report of handling also fails to consider the upper level of the extension as part of the overall design. The upper floor extension is designed to be an integral part of the extension viewed as a whole. The report of handling suggests an alternative design which would make use of the slope on the site by dropping the floor level or extension. The proposal has been designed to remove existing changes of level within the house, but Appendix 4 of the appellant's case shows an alternative to that design of an extension which would comply with the suggestion and which would also be within, which means it would not need planning permission. It's suggested that this design would be more incongruous than that proposed, and most importantly, it doesn't find favour with the applicant. To summarise the report of handling, the traditional character of the cottage has been preserved through a previous extension, with the ground floor extension being kept below the roof slope and the dormer being kept back from the wallhead. The proposed dormer projects to the elongated roof line and has the appearance of a two-storey, flat roof extension rather than a traditional dormer. Its design is unsympathetic and its proportions are excessive. While it would constitute a contemporary addition, it is neither compatible with or complementary to the existing house. The ground floor extension as proposed is also out of character and incongruous. While a contemporary design might be acceptable, it would be advisable to drop its floor level to remove the need for the proposed underbuild and lower its roof level below the level of the existing roof. The proposal introduces a window at ground level with a view towards the neighbour's rear garden. As the boundary between the gardens is insufficient to mitigate this view, the proposed window would constitute a privacy failure. There were no representations received for the application. Material considerations. The policy cited in the report of handling and the first reason for refusal is material, as is the concern over privacy, which is the second reason for refusal. The council's householder design guide is also a material consideration, although it doesn't form part of the reasons for refusal. The fact that the applicant could construct an alternative design of an extension without having to apply for planning permission is not material. Some observations. The corner of the proposed extension would be slightly visible at ground floor level from the road. The side window which faces the boundary between the application property and the neighbour's rear garden is secondary, and any concerns over overlooking could be mitigated by a condition to enhance the boundary treatment, or to obscure the glazing in that window, or to remove the window entirely. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. I'll open up for questions. Councillor Anderson.
Okay, I don't have really any objections to what's been proposed. So I'm mindful to approve, so I'm not going to question it much.
Sorry, Councillor. Sorry, Councillor Anderson, it's questions only at this stage, not, yeah. Do you have any questions for Mr. Burton?
So, sorry, I can't hear.
So Hugh, it's a question. Do you have a question or at this stage? Okay.
Sorry, just the one. The sticking point seems to be overlooking, or one of the sticking points seems to be the overlooking of the neighbour's garden. Are we? Is it in our gift to condition for opaque windows, perhaps on the upper floor?
The overlooking concern, councillor, is from the ground floor extension rather than the upper floor. The upper floor, I think, would have the same overlooking issues as the current dormer, so there's no worsening of the current situation. The second reason for refusal is about concerns the ground floor window. There's a corner window to the ground floor extension which would look towards the neighbour's garden. It's 7.5 metres away. The second reason for refusal suggests that is a privacy failure. A window of which is less than 9 metres from a boundary and which is not screened and which gives a view of a private garden area would be a privacy failure. The applicant takes the view that because there is mitigation, there's a hedge there already, that this doesn't constitute a privacy failure. However, the proposed ground floor extension would be built up, so there is the possibility that this window, being slightly higher than ground level, would look over the hedge that's existing and which you can see in the photograph on the screen there, into the neighbour's rear garden. It is within the gift of this committee, if minded to grant, to attach a condition which either removes that window entirely or requires it to have obscured glazing.
Thanks very much. Just to avoid confusion, I know normally, we put a condition on for upper floor windows. I was meaning that you clarified for me nicely. Thanks. So we can do it on a ground floor as well.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Only just a clarification point for Mr. Burton is the fact that it's only visible from the road on a very short stretch. That's all. There's no other visibility.
Yes.
Just to clarify that. Fine. Thank you. So, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Anderson.
I'm happy to.
Thank you. Councillor James.
Yeah, happy to proceed. Enough information. Thanks, convener.
Thank you very much. So on this occasion, I'll lead off first of all. This is a straightforward extension to be put at the back of a property. The important factor for me was that it's not seen from the road, or very, very scarcely seen from the road, which in this case, Mr. Burton has confirmed it is. Every extension is obviously the design of every individual. In this instance, obviously, it's the design they are looking for. The fact that it is at the rear of the property is not seen from anywhere else. In my mind, I am of the opinion to grant the appeal on this occasion, subject to any normal conditions that we might apply. So my decision is to grant the appeal. Councillor Anderson.
Yep.
I'm minded as well to grant approval. The appeal, sorry.
Councillor James.
Full house. I'm also minded to grant the approval for pretty much the same reasons as yourself, convener. However, I think it would be a bit remiss of us if we weren't going to attach a condition for frosted glass to deal with the privacy impact on the ground floor. So I'd go with approval, but with a condition for frosted glass on that particular window overlooking the neighbouring property.
So, Mr. Elliott, over to you. I think we've all agreed.
Yes, thank you, Convener. That's a clear grant of the review. Councillor James has mentioned the obscure glazing, which would be the ground floor window facing the neighbour. Convener, you've agreed. Councillor Anderson, I want to make sure you agree with that obscure glazing as well. You're content? Yes, you're content with that. So therefore granted, and we will attend to the conditions along the lines we talked about. I'll bring in Mr. Burton. Is there anything Mr. Burton needs to address on the conditions? I've already addressed the obscure glazing on the ground floor.
I would have thought that that is sufficient to ensure that it meets the terms of the planning guidance and policy.
Thank you. So the appeal is agreed on that particular case. We'll now move to number 4.3, which is the alteration and extension to a dwelling house at Meadows of Fengarth, Dunkeld, and I will ask Mr. Burton again to introduce.
Thank you, Chair. This one is a proposal for a 1.5 story extension to a single story cottage located in woodland off the A923 in a wooded area to the northeast of Dunkeld. We can start with the first slide, please. Again, this is just to show context. You can see a red circle around the application site. You can see it's very much on its own. It's not an open countryside. It's in ancient woodland with the loch to the east there, and the A923 immediately to the west. Next slide, please. This shows the cottage in the context of the road. Now, what it doesn't show is that the ground slopes down from the road, and the access is at the northern part of the red line there. So it's not, you can't see the cottage or its surroundings from the road. Next slide, please. Looking down, this is looking down the road towards the access to the cottage. The access is just there's a small gate you can see. The access is just beside that gate, so it's on the bend of the road. Next slide, please. And that's the gate on the left. So you can see the ground rises from the road and it falls down again to the application site. Next slide, please. And that's looking up the road from the site access. And next slide, please. Looking back down the road from standing actually in the site access. Next slide, please. Right, the next few slides just follow the access road into the site. You can see there's a dropped curb, and then you can see the access driveway beyond that. Next slide, please. And if we follow that, the next few slides, it takes us to the site along the access road. So next slide, please. This is going straight down from the road. It turns right at the bottom, as you can see. Next slide, please. And the next slide. You can just see the corner of the cottage from this one, just after the bend in the road, as it were. And the boundary is on the left-hand side, the post and wire fence. That is the site boundary as well. Next slide, please. The cottage, you see, has a skylight, and there is habitation. There are 2 rooms in the roof of the cottage, but it's as a traditional cottage of some age. The rooms are very small. It doesn't lend itself to attic conversion. Next slide, please. This is the rear of the cottage, which we just saw in the previous site. You see how much the ground slopes up towards the road, and how wooded the area around about it is. Next slide, please. That's the front of the cottage. Clearly, it's not habited at the moment. Inhabited, excuse me, at the moment. But that shows the cottage front as is. And again, you can see the wooded slopes which lead up towards the road on the left-hand side there. Next slide, please. That's looking down towards the front door of the cottage. Next slide, please. And this is the garden area of the cottage. That's in front of the front door that you've just seen. So you can see the set boundary. It's clearly marked by a timber fence. Next slide, please. And again, that's just showing the garden area. On the there is a square. Pardon me. There's a square paving stone in front, which you can see there. There is some form of drainage on site, but it's not immediately apparent just where the drainage goes. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, right. If we could go back to the second of the aerial shots, please, that might be the best one to see it in a bit of context. Yes, thank you. So the applicant's a 1.5-storey building is proposed linked to the existing cottage immediately to the west of the cottage, linked by a glass link corridor. The ground floor rooms of the existing cottage would accommodate a bedroom, bathroom, and sitting room, and the extension would contain a kitchen, dining room, utility, and WC at ground floor level, and 2 bedrooms and bathroom at the upper floor. Because of the limited height of the original cottage, the new element would be higher than the existing building. To summarise the applicant's case, the applicant wants to use the cottage as a family home, but the limited headroom in the cottage, 1.5 metres in the upper floor, means that this upper floor is not suitable for use as bedrooms. The extension has been designed to complement the existing cottage, and the ridge height, while greater than that of the cottage, is no higher than the chimney height of the existing cottage. The design is intended to respect the character and design of the original cottage by minimising the intervention of the new element on the old. The height of the new element has been controlled as much as possible in an attempt to respect the appearance and character of this existing cottage while minimising its footprint. The point is made that if the extension were a single-storey extension, it would result in a sprawling, over-dominant form of extension. It's accepted that the proposal is contrary to the Council's design guidance for extensions, but suggests that it's appropriate in this case for the reasons stated and because of the isolated setting, which means that the cottage and the extension are both invisible from the public highway. The details of the existing drainage system are not fully known. The intention is to improve on the existing system by means of a new septic tank or treatment plant. A detailed design will be produced if planning permission is granted. To summarise the report of handling, the proposed extension would far exceed the proportions of the existing house in terms of footprint, more than doubling it, in terms of its raised eaves and ridge height as well. The layout would project beyond the principal elevation and the rear elevation. The extension would dominate and overwhelm the modest proportions and traditional character of the cottage, which makes the proposal contrary to the Council's placemaking guides, policies 1A and 1BC of the local development plan. This forms the first reason for refusal. The property is located within a woodland area designated ancient woodland, and it's noted that no trees are affected by the proposal. A strong degree of enclosure would remain, and the proposal will be unlikely to have a significant landscape impact. There will be no adverse impacts on residential amenity. No information has been provided on the drainage arrangements, so it has not been demonstrated, as is required, that the total phosphorus output does not exceed the permitted level, and there would be no adverse impact on the water environment. And this forms the second reason for refusal. Excuse me. No representations were received for the application. To turn to the material considerations, the LDP is a material consideration, and policies 1A and 1BC are correctly identified as material to the proposals in terms of placemaking. Policies 38A, 45A, 53A and 53B are correctly identified as material considerations in terms of the water environment. The immediate environment of the cottage is also material. To finish with some observations, the current cottage is not suitable for residential use, as its size means the upper floor accommodation cannot be used. If it is to be used rather than left to become derelict, it has to be extended. What the committee needs to consider is whether this and the specific characteristics of the site, its isolated location, which means it can't be seen from out with the site, are sufficient to merit setting aside the requirements of the LDP in terms of placemaking. Many planning decisions are a balance of seemingly competing considerations. In this case, what needs to be weighed against the provisions of the LDP is the characteristics of the site and the reasons behind the proposed design. The desire to retain the existing cottage as a structure distinct from the extension, which is required to make it acceptable as a family home. The applicant makes the point that the current drainage system is largely unknown, and that the new septic tank or treatment plant proposed will represent an improvement. However, if the committee is minded to grant permission, the local development plan requires that the applicant first demonstrates that the drainage arrangements proposed would not damage the water environment. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. I'll open up to questions. Councillor James.
Convener, I don't have any further questions for Mr. Burton. I don't think. I've got plenty of information here. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Anderson.
Just wondering if the proposed extension would be visible from the public road. There's quite a lot of trees on the site, aren't there?
Yeah. I don't believe it would, Councillor, no, because it's not just the trees, it's also the fact that the ground rises from the road and falls towards the cottage. So I believe that would be it wouldn't be seen from the public road.
Thank you, Councillor. I have no questions myself. So, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us, that is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor? Or do we require more information? Councillor James.
Thanks, Convener. I think given its location in the Luna Valley catchment area, and it is a special conservation area, and this particular site is very close to the Loch of Lowes. I think it would be sensible to have information on phosphorus mitigation. So for that reason, I think a deferral on this occasion for that information.
Given that situation, I'm sure Councillor Anderson and myself, we both agree, I think. So, Councillor, sorry, Mr. Elliott, would you like to come in on it?
Thank you, Convener. Members, you are obviously correctly identifying that there is no detailed information on phosphate mitigation. I'm going to quickly read out policy, which will help in terms of for the terms of deferral. But policy 45A, the second paragraph, is all applicants will be required to submit details of the proposed method of drainage and details of phosphate phosphorus mitigation where applicable, with our application for planning permission and adopt the principles of best available technology, not entailing excessive costs, to the satisfaction of the planning authority in conjunction with SEPA. So given what you've said, I think the deferral would be to defer for the applicant to produce further information on phosphate mitigation with development management in conjunction with SEPA to comment on that information and then to be brought back to you. Is that agreed?
That would be correct, I think. Yes. Yep. Yes. Thank you. So this paper has been deferred. 4.3 is deferred for further information. Thank you, members. We'll move on now to application 4.4. This is the erection, in principle, of a dwelling house 30 metres southwest of 1 Bardmoney Farm Cottage in Alyth. And I would ask Mr. Burton to introduce again.
Thank you, Chair. A brief description before we go into the slides. The applications for the erection of a dwelling house is for permission in principle. This time, not for full. It's not a full application. 30 metres southwest of number 1 Bardmoney Farm Cottage, Alyth. Indicative plan submitted shows a single-storey timber-clad house set back from the site with a driveway and parking in front. It also shows planting along the western and eastern boundaries to the site with small groups of trees at the front and rear of the site. I would point out to the committee, however, it is clearly indicative and it doesn't actually form part of the application. The applicant has submitted it in order to show how a dwelling might be accommodated within the site. Part of the site is within the consultation distance of a major hazard pipeline, although the Health and Safety Executive does not advise against granting planning permission. If we could turn to the slides, please. The first one shows. The first one doesn't show very much at all, I'm afraid. Where there's something showing the old piggery, that is the site in context. If we could turn to the next slide, please. Right, so you can clearly see the site here adjacent to the row of cottages to the east. It's roughly triangular, and it's bounded by, as you can see on the two sides to the west and the south, by fields. You can see the structure immediately to the east. The large structure that's known as the old smithy. It's a large barn-like feature. The position of the cottage shown in the indicative plan is closer to the smithy than it is to the row of cottages. Next slide, please. This is from, pardon me. This is from the road leading up to the site, and you can see the end of the row of cottages quite clearly. They're single story with roof lights. The site is to the right. Now, if you can see, if you could note, there's alongside the road, there's a post and wire fence. You can see that post and wire fence stretching away into the distance to the right of the road. That is the boundary of the site. Next slide, please. And that's looking along the road, looking along the row of cottages. Next slide, please. Looking into the site, this is from the entrance to the site. You can see the post and wire fence, which marks the boundary of the site, unit, and the neighbouring field. Next slide, please. Now, looking, this is. You can see there the gable of the closest cottage to the site, and the barn, which is known as the old smithy. You can see there's another barn just beyond it. From what I saw on site, there wasn't any evidence of the barn having had much use. Certainly not as a smithy for some time. It could be used as storage, but it's certainly not in any use beyond that. Next slide, please. Now, this is taken from the pretty much the corner of the site. You can see the Smithy barn on the right-hand side and the cottages beyond that. You can see it is mostly grassed, and the post and wire fence on the left-hand side of the picture is all that separates it from the adjacent field. Next slide, please. And this is from the corner of the site, looking more back towards the existing buildings. You can see the post and wire fence this time on the right-hand side, separating the site from the field to that side. You can see that from both of these pictures, the fields on both sides are the same level as the site. Next slide, please. And this is looking from the site across the adjacent fields. Next slide, please. And again, looking beyond the site into the adjacent fields. The site clearly projects into the countryside. So next slide, please. And again, looking out towards, I think that's towards Alith, in fact, but it's looking into the neighbouring field anyway. Next slide, please. Right. I think that's probably the best one to have on the screen while a retired couple who've been searching for a house in the area close to their family for some time without success. The site is an awkward section of land which appears to be left over when two larger adjacent fields were realigned. It's Class 2 agricultural land, hasn't been farmed for some time. It has long established boundaries formed by the site's topography and marked by fencing. The site is adjacent to a row of cottages which constitute a building group within the terms of the local development plan. This, it's suggested, makes the proposal comply with Policy 19, housing in the countryside. The first category of development allowed under this policy is the development of a house which extends an existing group into a readily defined adjacent site. To quote from that part of the policy, the readily defined site would be formed by existing topography, roads, or well-established existing landscape features. The proposal is submitted also complies with the local development plan policies 1A and 1B placemaking, in that it utilises a small corner of a field which is difficult to cultivate because of its topography and size. The proposed layout would continue the row of cottages in a way which would contribute positively to the quality of the surrounding and built environment, making a positive contribution to the character and amenity of the immediate surroundings. To summarise the report of handling, the application sites within an area of open countryside close to a row of cottages. As such, it requires to be assessed against Policy 19, housing in the countryside. The most relevant category of this policy is number 1, building groups. It's considered that the site lies out with the existing building group in an area of open farmland which lacks sufficient established boundary treatment to provide adequate containment to satisfy the policy. It's also considered that the layout of any house on the plot, the position of any house on the plot, would fail to respect character and form of the existing group. It's noted that the existing group of cottages comprises an attractive linear grouping of stone-built cottages. No representations were received. Material considerations. Policy 19 of the Local Development Plan housing in the countryside has been correctly identified as the most relevant material consideration, as the appeal site is situated within open countryside. To conclude with some observations, the judgment here is whether the committee considers the site to be close enough and potentially contiguous enough to the row of cottages to the east to be considered as part of the group if it were to be developed. The application is for permission in principle, so the drawing that has been submitted of a timber-clad building is not part of the application. If committee decides to grant planning permission, a further application will need to be submitted to the council and approved before construction can take place. The applicant states in the appeal statement that they would be happy to be guided by the planning service pardon me, on the detail of the design site layout, and that planting and other boundary treatments would be part of that application. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. I'll open to questions. Councillor Anderson.
are there powers within the planning laws that the proposed house would be built in line with same condition, slate roof, stone, everything else, window designs as the existing group that is there?
Sorry, I didn't catch the first part of your question, councillor, but I take it that you were asking if the proposed house could be finished in that way and designed in that way. Is that right?
Under the control of the council, that would be part of the conditions.
That would potentially be in control of the council. The council has to, if this permission, if this application is granted, council then have to approve the what's called reserved matters, or what's called matters approved by condition, which means that they would have to approve the detailed design and layout and finish of the building. So yes, the council could control the building to the extent that they could require it to be single story and finished in slate and so on. Pardon me. I have to say that the layout of the site doesn't really lend itself to extending the cottages as a way of developing it. There would have to be an access left in between the gable of the existing cottage and the new building for access to the barn at the back. So it wouldn't be able to be joined onto the gable, but would have to be set back from the gable by some by, I would guess, 3 meters at least. The in point of fact, it might be difficult to control the potential design and layout of the house to the extent that the councillor is what the councillor mentioned.
Thank you.
Councillor James.
Thanks, convener. No further questions. I think we've got everything in front of us. Thanks.
Thank you. Just one point. If we could just go back a couple of photographs, if that's possible, to the boundary. I just want to look at that one again. That's possible. We can go back.
Yeah.
That's
yeah. I think that's about
that's
4
the best one we've
photographs in.
got. Yeah. It's just obviously we've only got a post and wire fence,
yeah.
but there's obviously a growth of
others. Yeah.
Of grass there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's obviously just a post and wire fence, but there's obviously a growth of grass and the growth, which forms some form of boundary there, I would think. Would you agree?
Yeah, I didn't hear all of that.
Yeah, sorry, I was saying that obviously we have a post and wire fence, but
yes,
there is undergrowth growing there, which would appear to have been there for some time, which, although it's not the best, does reinforce some form of boundary there.
Yes, and the same is true of the other. I think if you go to the next slide, that also shows it from another angle. Yeah, so the same is true of that boundary there. Pardon me. In fact, you can see both boundaries in this picture. That while the application site is pretty much on the same level as the adjacent fields, some grass has grown up in along the line of the post and wire fence, which you're correct does give the appearance of a boundary.
Thank you. Right, so members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor. Councillor Anderson.
I agree.
Councillor James.
Yep, I agree as well. I think we have enough information. Thanks.
Thank you both. So on this occasion, I think I will lead. This application's situation hinges on 2 points, I think, and that is the question of the boundary, the existing boundary, and the question of whether the existing property can form a line with the existing group. As far as the boundary is concerned, there's as I said, and my question was, there's a post and wire fence. with obviously some undergrowth which is accumulated, I would suspect, over a number of years. It's not a perfect boundary, I agree, as we'd expect normally, but it is there in my mind, and I would think that would be sufficient to say that there is an existing boundary. As to the property itself, looking at the size of the plot and the triangular shape of it, it's quite obvious, I think, that we couldn't get a house in there which would form a line. However, looking at the indicative plan that we have, I think that a house could sit there and look reasonably in place in my mind. So I'm of an inclination to agree the appeal. The only thing I would ask is if we can have a condition to ensure that whatever the future property might be, that it would be a single-storey property in line with the other block of properties. But in my mind at this stage, I think, agree the appeal in principle. Thank you. Councillor Anderson.
I also agree in principle.
And Councillor James.
Can't believe this convener, we're all agreeing again. Yeah, the site does lend itself. Google's your friend. It is an obvious extension to what's already there, and therefore, you know, forms part of the group. And this is in principle, so I'd be quite happy to have something in principle.
So, Mr. Elliott, we have a concurrence of all three of us agreeing to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. My understanding is that all three members have agreed to grant the review, which is an in-principle application. If I've understood correctly, you're saying that you think it accords with policy, just in terms of the boundary treatment. You also, Convener, I think, or Councillor James, can't remember which, you mentioned a single story, condition at single story. I just want to be clear. My understanding is there could be what you're suggesting. Are you suggesting it would be potential for roof accommodation in the roof space by way of roof lights, but not dormer windows? In other words, similar to what's existing.
I'm asking similar to what's existing. So, as you said, with roof lights, yes.
Right, try again. There we go. That went off because of the other mic going on. So I want to make clear that the conditioning the single-storey accommodation could mean there could still be accommodation in the roof space, perhaps lit by roof lights, not dormer windows. So you could have two levels of accommodation, but the appearance of single-storey.
That's correct, yes. So it follows the line of the existing properties, yes.
Sorry, Mr. Burton, every time I think Convener presses his button, the cancels mine out, which is why I'm not heard. I'm not blaming Convener, it's the way the system works. Mr. Burton, have you anything to add to that? Hopefully you heard that as grant in accordance with development plan and subject to a condition that would be single storey in appearance that does allow for accommodation in the roof space, not by way of dormer windows, but perhaps by way of roof lights. Is that sufficient for your purposes?
Yes, I'm sure that we could between us come up with a suitable condition.
Thank you, members. So we'll now move on to the next application, which is number 45. This is the siting of a holiday accommodation unit and sauna unit in retrospect, land 145 metres northeast of the Kirkmichael Hotel in Main Street, Kirkmichael. Mr. Burton, if you'd like to introduce this one.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, as you said, the proposal is for the siting of holiday accommodation as sauna on land 145 metres northeast of the Kirkmichael Hotel, Kirkmichael. The hut has been in place for over 2 years. The sauna hut, the main hut, I should say, has been in place for 2 years, with the sauna hut added a year ago. The council initiated enforcement action on the hut because planning permission was not sought, and a previous application was refused in January this year. This application differs from the previous one with regard to additional planting, which the applicant hopes will meet the concerns of the council or will help to make the hut accord better with the policy. Pardon me. The unit is a former shepherd's hut, which would originally have been moved as required. The accommodation provided is a single room with a bed, table and chairs and a small kitchen area. Attached to the hut are a composting toilet and a shower unit, and adjacent to the hut is a square wooden structure containing a sauna. The hut is located at the end of a footpath and surrounded by open countryside. The intention here is to provide an off-grid holiday experience. The first slide, which is there, shows the site in context of the village and shows the route to the hut. You basically leave the main road just close to the Carmichael Hotel, up a public pathway where the pardon me, where the pathway branches left. That it is no longer a public footpath, but it's just a mown path across a field, which will become clear in the next pictures. But you can see in this one the shapes in the site, which are the hut and the sauna. Pardon me. And you can see that there's a significant area of ground in the shape of a field between that and the buildings in Carmichael. Next slide, please. So that's the entrance to the public footpath, the start of the public footpath in the actual village. Next slide, please. And you can see on the left of the path is the stables. It's a bed and breakfast establishment that the footpath runs along, passes the door of. Next slide, please. And that's the start of the public footpath at the end of the parking area in front of the stables. Next slide, please. And you can see the public footpath extends. It's quite well maintained and it's obviously well used north towards the away from the village. Next slide, please. The public footpath narrows as it moves away from the village, but it's still surfaced and it's still quite well maintained. You can see it's rising the whole time though. Pardon me. Next slide, please. And the footpath continues rising between two fields. Next slide, please. And this is where the footpath ends at the gate. Rather, is where the footpath ends, and you have to take a sharp left to get to the holiday accommodation. Next slide, please. That is from this picture is taken from the gate that you just saw. And you can see the shepherd's hut in the distance. Next slide, please. This is at the end of the cut path on the way to the application site. So the application site is bounded by the gate there, and you can see the fence stretching away to the right, to the left rather, and you can see a post and wire fence on the right. The trees at the back form the boundary on that side. Next slide, please. This is looking into the site itself. You can see that the grass is cut. There's a couple of chairs there for people. The sauna hut is the darker one, the smaller one. The shepherd's hut is the one to the left, the white one. And then you can see the shepherd's hut extends to just about where there's a little lean-to area, a lean-to structure, and beyond that is the block, if you like, that has the composting toilet and the shower. So the shepherd's hut is still on wheels. It's still the original shepherd's hut, but the composting toilet and the shower are not. They are they're on the ground. You can see the lean-to building that projects beyond the side of the hut. That is part of the, as I understand, is part of the composting toilet. Next slide, please. This is looking into along the boundary of the site. You can see it's quite a bit higher than the agricultural polytunnel that's down to the left, and you can see there's extensive woodland beyond that. Next slide, please. Looking on along the other the other side of the site, the other boundary, you can see it's open countryside on one side and woodland beyond it. Next slide, please. And this is looking down towards Kirkmichael from the gate, pardon me, from the gate that leads into the site. You can see the roofs of the village beyond the field. The village is obviously below the level of this site. Next slide, please. And that's looking back towards along the path which takes you to the site. The woods, the trees that you can see are they mark the public footpath that leads up from the village towards the site. The two buildings you see there are not part of the application site. To be quite honest with you, I'm not quite sure what function they serve, but they didn't seem to be in use when I was there. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think that's probably the best slide to stay on for the rest of my presentation. To summarise the applicant's case, the development is not visible from any nearby houses, and any guests can park in the Kirkmichael Hotel car park, so there are no traffic implications. The additional planting proposed, 3 each of hazel, holly, spindle, juniper and viburnum opulus shrubs, and 3 each of birch, rowan, gean and field maple trees, will address the landscaping issues raised in the reason for refusal. And the applicant states that he believes that the proposal accords with relevant council policies. To summarise the report of handling, policies 1, placemaking, which seeks to ensure that new developments do not have an adverse impact on an area, and 8, rural business, which offers support for rural business diversification, are relevant. The proposal is not considered to be in accordance with either policy, as both policies require new development to be satisfactorily accommodated within the landscape. 18 representations were received, 12 of which supported the proposal and 6 objected. These comments in support cite the eco-tourism qualities of the proposal and welcome the additional income that the development brings to the village. Some also make the point that the development does not overlook any properties in the village and is not overlooked by any properties. The objectors cite reasons of parking, servicing of the property, that the property is clearly visible from the village and has an adverse impact on its setting. Overlooking is also cited as a reason for objecting. It's claimed that the development overlooks properties in the village. To turn to material considerations, pardon me, the proposal's degree of compliance with the local development plan is material. Policies 1 and 8 are cited as relevant in the report of handling. The policies both require the proposal to be accommodated within the landscape and the environmental capacity of the site, and it's also required that the proposal doesn't have a detrimental impact on nearby residential properties. Policy 8, rural business and diversification, also requires that the development meets a specific need by virtue of its quality or location in relation to tourist facilities and is able to be accommodated within the local road network. Pardon me. Some of the issues raised by the representations are material, that of overlooking and parking, and whether the development impacts on the setting of the village. Matters that have been raised about the ownership of the hut are not material. So to finish with some observations, the committee needs to consider whether the proposed hut breaches policy 1 of the local development plan and whether it accords with or breaches policy 8. Its level of accordance with policy 1 is, I would suggest a straightforward judgment, while its level of accordance with Policy 8 is a balanced judgment regarding different elements of the policy. Those requiring the proposal to be accommodated within the landscape and the support that the policy gives for tourist-related development that would support the village financially. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. We'll go to questions. If I could ask a few first of all, just to clarify that there are no services at this facility. No electric, no gas, no water. I presume people can't cook there or anything like that.
There is a small kitchen area within the shepherd's hut. I don't know what extent that allows cooking. There are no services, so you're correct. The development is serviced by the owner, who visits and deals with the any composting toilet issues and any other issues. So it's not connected to the grid in any way. It's not connected in terms of water or sewerage, and it's not connected with in terms of it's not connected to the electricity grid either.
Okay, it's just that I think one of the photographs seems to show some Calagas bottles outside. I presume that's just to power the kitchen.
I would guess that is. I don't know what they were, to be honest with you. The site isn't in use at the moment. While this application is being determined, they could be. I guess that they were to do with the either that or the composting toilet, or maybe water barrels for the shower and so on.
Okay. The view situation. The photograph you showed us was all we could see really was just the roof level of the village. I'm assuming therefore that if we reverse that, it's unlikely anybody could see this site from the village itself anyway. Can you see it in any way, shape or form when you're approaching or through the village?
I walked along the main street trying to get a view of it, and I couldn't see it. The view between the high street or main street and the application site is blocked by the houses there. So whether or not you can see it from the rear windows of any of the houses in the village, I don't know. But
look at the photographs you gave. It would appear to be difficult, I would have thought.
Yes.
You could only just see the roofs from the grass. But
yes.
The only other question I have, and that's either yourself or perhaps Mr. Elliott, is that if the review body was of an opinion to grant this, do we open up a precedent for further shepherd huts to come into play in that field or anywhere nearby? But in that particular field, I suppose, is the obvious question. Do we open a precedent for that?
I could make some comment on that, Councillor, which you might find useful. Not far away, about 500 metres, I believe, consent has been granted for 2 mobile homes or caravans, lodges, perhaps holiday lodges for holiday accommodation at another farm, which one of the representations makes reference to. These are quite different to this. These are both mobile home types of units which are connected to the grid and have kitchens, etc., etc. But there does already seem to be a precedent for mobile home holiday accommodation in the area.
I understand that. What I'm saying is, in this particular instance, in this field, could the applicant actually then put more of this structures or more of the similar structures in this particular field? Or we open up a precedent for more in the immediate area? I don't know if Mr. Elliott might want to comment on that.
Yeah.
Convener, I think from a practical point of view, you can see the possibility, and that's as far as I can go, because any further, it would have to be a further application, and that would have to be assessed in its merits. Members will also be aware there's an issue with whether they would obtain a caravan, this one and any other ones would obtain a caravan site licence. That strictly isn't within your remit, that's to do with environmental health. So I can only recognise the possibility, but any further application would have to be assessed separately.
Right, so Councillor James, any questions for yourself?
Just one, thanks, convener, and I'm picking up on this. Obviously, people have been either for or against this, and one such person has said that he's lost his privacy because this overlooks his property. Did you see that this was overlooking a property, which would cause a loss of privacy?
I tried to see a property which was overlooked from the application site, and I couldn't, I have to say, councillor. That's not to say there isn't one. Just in my site visit, I was unable to see that. What I wonder is whether the increased foot traffic along the public footpath that runs up the side of that building that we saw in the picture called the Stables, the bed and breakfast. There's a couple of dwellings there, and that might be seen as a loss of privacy if you know, there's an increase in foot traffic along that footpath. But it is a public footpath, so that's beyond that. I couldn't see how the people staying in the Shepherd's Hut would have any view of any existing property in Kirkmichael, which would give rise to any privacy issues.
Councillor Anderson.
Yeah. One or two little questions. The boundary shown in orange, how much if it is owned by the applicant? It won't be, because the public footpath is shown within that boundary.
Yes.
And when you get to, it goes a path across the field to this area where the site of the development is that within his ownership?
I can't say that for sure, councillor. I believe it is. I believe that when you leave the public footpath, you're on ground that's either owned or controlled by the applicant. Certainly,
and also the ground to the Kirkmichael itself, that remaining part of that field.
I'm afraid I can't answer that, councillor. I don't know that. I understand that the site is owned by the applicant, but as you say, the public footpath is not. That's outlined in red as part of the application site boundary, because the site has to, by law, by planning regulations, connect to a public road. And that doesn't confer any ownership issues, or that doesn't suggest that there's ownership of the public footpath there. But as I understand it, the field, the path through the field and the application site itself is owned by the applicant.
Yeah, although the weather's getting quite warm here, a sauna would not really function with air temperature outside. There must be electricity or something to power a sauna in this country.
I think a sauna can operate with charcoal and heated coals.
Okay, well, I haven't found one of these yet. Not to worry. I've in some council areas, I say that in Highland area, Highland region, such developments would be encouraged, especially small scale ones. Are there different regulations between, say, I don't know, it used to be Old Ross and Cromarty Council, which is now part of Highland Region, and Perth and Ross? Each council has its own rules, is that correct?
Absolutely. The policies that Highland Council have in terms of holiday accommodation will be different to those of Perth and Kinross. And as you say, the emphasis might well be more on encouraging tourist development there, which would mean that Policy 8, for instance, their equivalent of Policy 8, might lean more towards encouraging some kind of tourist development. Policy 8 does, of the Perth and Kinross Local Development Plan, is there to encourage tourism-related development or diversification type development, which is compatible in other ways. And I'd imagine Highland Council rather, will have its elements of the policy which control development in terms of amenity, overlooking and so on as well, just as the Perth and Kinross one does. But you're correct in that they are, and they will be different.
Just to come in there, I think it's just to add to that, yes. How another council or planning authority deals with a similar application wouldn't be relevant, because we all have our own local development plans, and it has to be assessed against your own individual local development plan. So it wouldn't be a bearing that the fact that these might be granted elsewhere.
Any further questions, Councillor Anderson? No? Okay. So members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning officer, or do we require any more information? Councillor James?
No, I think we've got enough before us. Thanks, convener.
I was agree.
Thank you. So, okay, we'll proceed, and on this occasion I will lead. There's obviously a growing desire, I think, to holiday in a way in which you get back to nature in some ways, but in doing so have accommodation which is perhaps a little bit more upmarket than just a tent in a field. This would seem to be something along the lines of what we're talking about. As we've established, there's no link to any services, no plumbing in, no electricity. There may well be some gas supply there, but it's in bottles. It's not a permanent structure we're dealing with. And for the photographs and the aerial photograph we have before us, it's obvious this is a facility well away from the village, not accessible by vehicle. It has to be on foot, or as I think I've read somewhere, by wheelbarrow to get your cases up to the actual accommodation. There have been comments about whether or not parking can be in the hotel. I believe the applicant is now no longer associated with the hotel, so we must assume perhaps that parking is not available there. It's very limited anyway. But looking at the accommodation, it would likely need to be one car per holiday. It appears they can only sleep probably two people. There will be just one extra car in the village, and I'm sure that could be accommodated quite easily. My mind at the moment is to agree the appeal. There is, as far as I can see, no overlooking of anybody's houses. It's so far away from the village that that's unlikely. There is no vehicular intrusion to those houses that the people have to pass to get to the site. It's all on foot. Parking will be just one car. So my inclination on this occasion is to agree the appeal. I know there's been comments made about additional landscaping. I'm not sure that I would actually insist upon that. It is so far away. I have a concern that, as has been mentioned earlier, whether or not this would actually get approval as a caravan licence, and obviously with short-term licensing coming in from October, I'm not sure whether we get past that, bearing in mind the difficulty of access for any emergency vehicles to get to the site. So I have my reservations on that level, but that's not a planning consideration for us. It is with the paperwork before us, and my opinion is to grant the appeal. Councillor Anderson.
I would concur with the convener.
And Councillor James.
I don't think there's anything I could add to what you've said, convener. Thanks. I'd agree with you as well.
So we have a unanimous agreement, Mr. Elliott, to agree the
Thank you, convener. Just looking at it, would it be fair to say that although there may not be a landscape framework, the overriding factor is that it's not seen, but it's not visible within the village, and
that's the overriding factor, yes.
It would be grant subject to any suitable conditions, informative in terms, on the basis that it accords with the development plan.
Agreed, yes, I think we're all in agreement, yes.
Turn to Mr. Burton. Is there anything else you need on conditions? Is there anything you want to cover with members on conditions? I think we did cover the really no landscaping is what you said. Yes. Turn over to Mr. Burton.
I wouldn't have thought so. The application includes landscaping, which would have to be implemented by the applicant. So I would suggest that's sufficient.
Okay, then that's unanimously agreed the appeal on that one. Thank you very much. And we move to the last paper, which is 51A. This is a paper that's come back to us after a deferment. It is for S42 application to delete condition 6, access upgrade of a permission on land 180 metres southwest of Pow Hill Cottage, Rumbling Bridge. Mr. Burton, if you'd like to introduce at this stage. You're on mute, Mr.
I do beg your pardon. The application is for the removal of a condition, condition 6, attached to permission 20 FLL for the erection of a dwelling house and associated office studio at land 180 metres southwest of Pow Hill Cottage, Rumbling Bridge, Kinross. Now, condition 6 states, prior to the development hereby approved being completed or brought into use, all matters regarding access, car parking, road layout, design and specification, including the disposal of surface water, shall be in accordance with the standards required to the council by the council as roads authority. In advance, the application, this application came to the local review body at such a time where I wasn't able to actually visit the site, but I was instead relying on photographs taken by my predecessor. I'm not apologising because they're his photographs. I'm apologising because they're slightly out of date, and I think development might have moved on a bit since they were taken. So to look at the first picture, the application site is at the end of an access lane, which you can see where it's Pow Mill Caravan Site and Cattery is shown. Between there and the application site are a series of other applications which have been approved, and they are for other single properties, self-built properties. Next slide, please. This is looking towards the access to the main road. You can see it's the access is not made. It's not tarmacked. Next slide, please. Looking further into the access, you can see it's not much more than a single track. Next slide, please. And you can see it remains the same. There is a verge for drainage, for runoff water, a slight a shallow swale, as it were, but not much else. Next slide, please. And this is opposite Pow Mill Cottage. Looking further into the site, you can see the access driveway continues as a non-tarmac road. Next slide, please. And passing Pow Mill Cottage. And next slide, please. Now, part of plot 3C, you can see that some that some of the housing plots are under construction during this when these photographs were taken, which is why I'm saying that the application that these photographs are out of date, and given sufficient time, I would have preferred to have visited and supplied the committee with updated photographs so you could be aware of the current situation. Next slide, please. and you can see there's a mobile home and a caravan on plot 3C at the moment. Again, I understand that that situation has changed now. Next slide, please. And you can see that work has started on plot 3A. It also shows the access track continuing beyond that, beyond plot 3A towards towards the current application site. Next slide, please. And looking east, you can see the yellow arrow pointing to plot 1, which is the application site. So there's land in between this application site and plot 3A, which is being developed. Again, I would point out that the situation has apparently changed, and it would have been good to have given the committee up-to-date information on that, and I apologise for not having the time to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, if we could go back to the layout, to the original, the first picture rather, that shows the site within the context. Thank you. To summarise the applicant's case, condition 6 of the original application, pardon me, is linked to a roads construction consent of site E23 for up to 7 dwellings with associated class 4 office units. It was obtained by a third party prior to the applicant purchasing the site in 2018. The condition relates to the full 300 metres of the access road from the A977 east to the adjoining plot 1 to the west. So looking at the slide in front of you, you can see top right of that slide where the access driveway meets the A977. So condition 6 relates to all of the road, all of the driveway to the application site, which is bounded in red on the slide. The road is to be to adoptable standards. In broad terms, the condition is seen as contrary to Scottish Government guidance on rural development and the desirability of aligning planning and road services. Scottish Government Circular 4, 1998 provides 6 tests for planning conditions. Condition 6 is seen as failing to meet these tests, namely that the condition is necessary, relevant to planning, relevant to the development to be permitted, enforceable, precise and reasonable. These failings may be summarised as follows. Necessity. A single house does not need to be served by an adoptable standard road. The provision for the road to the west is not a necessary part of the approved development. The proposal would only be the 4th house, and the Scots Road Development Guide allows for 5 houses to be served by a private road. In terms of relevance to the development permitted, the standard approved under the road construction consent is not considered to be relevant to the scale of the permitted development of which could be served by a private road. Regarding enforceability, the access road is owned by a third party and out with the applicant's control. The applicant considers that in the event of a non-compliance with the condition and the serving of a breach of condition notice, Procurator Fiscal is unlikely to take action. Regarding precision, the wording of the condition does not require any works to be carried out. It is considered that, with the approval of the road construction consent, the condition has already been complied with fully. Regarding reasonableness, pardon me, imposing the cost of the total works, estimated at some £350,000, on the applicant's development proposal, without any prospect of him being reimbursed by others whose development would benefit from the upgraded road, is seen as unreasonable. The condition is based on speculation that there will be further development and makes the approved development financially unviable. It is considered that there is no reasonable prospect of more than 5 development units being served by the road. It is considered that the Council should have required a Section 75 agreement at the outset to have been entered into to ensure that the responsibility for the road was shared. It's also considered that there was an opportunity to require a mechanism to ensure a shared contribution to the cost and setting out site-specific requirements when allocating the site in the local development plan. The applicant recognises that some minor improvement to the condition of the access road may be justified. He proposes instead a Section 75 agreement concerning the upgrade of the section of his frontage onto the roadway. He is also willing to make a contribution to the improvement of the Bellmouth onto the A977 and share the costs of that improvement with others. He anticipates that other owners who are all subject to the same condition would choose the alternative of such a Section 75 agreement because they would then have the same individual prospect of meeting the total cost of the roadworks. They would not have the same prospect of meeting the total cost. While it's recognised that the work would not be carried out in a single phase, the unimproved section of road to the east is seen as adequate for his needs. It's also proposed that the specification of the road is less to the standard for adoption by the council. This lesser standard is seen as adequate for the level of development. The applicant recognises the innovative employment land use model involved and sees the suggested approach as a compromise to overcoming the stalemate that continues to affect the continuing development of the site. The report of handling summary is that the application site falls within a larger area allocation as an employment site within LDP2. The access road, which is part of the CoPath network, currently serves 3 houses, a caravan site and a working farm. While Condition 6 does not explicitly cite the road's construction consent, its purpose is to ensure that the access is upgraded to that adoptable standard. The condition has been part of all of the numerous planning permissions for dwelling houses with associated accommodations since the initial approval in 2003. In assessing the request for the deletion of Condition 6, the officer's report of handling is broadly cognizant with the applicant's previously stated views regarding the adoptable standard requirement, number of dwellings involved, terms of the National Roads Development Guide, and the overall failure of the condition to meet the tests of the circular. The report also highlights the issue of the deliverability of sites allocated through the LDP, which has come to prominence recently. While this mainly concerns large-scale housing sites, whether or not a delivery strategy could be secured for the site was considered during the preparation of LDP2. This allocation is of long-standing, dating back to the Kinross Area Local Plan of 2004. It is no longer in the ownership of a single party, the plots having been sold off. Consequently, it was concluded that such an approach was not feasible. The requirement to upgrade the access as part of the development site, as part of the development, is of long-standing and has been part of all the related planning consents. The applicant would have been aware of this when purchasing the site in 2018. The applicant has suggested that each plot upgrades its own frontage. However, none of the other plot owners have contacted the council indicating support for this approach. It's noted that planning permissions for plots 1 and 3D have expired. Plot 2 is now a 5-berth caravan site, and plots 3A, 3B and 3C have live permissions with the same planning conditions requiring the upgrading of the road. The suggested approach would not include the track frontage of Powell Mill Cottage, the section from the cottage to the public road, or the frontages of plots 1 and 3D. It's the officer's view that this suggestion does not provide a mechanism which would enable the track to be upgraded. It's noted that a lesser road specification is also envisaged. In this case, if the condition is deleted or amended to relate to only the frontage of the applicant's plot, the burden for the remainder would fall on the next plot. If that is treated in the same way, there would appear to be a strong possibility that the entire E23 site would become developed without an appropriately upgraded access. Regarding the financing and apportioning of costs, this is seen as a civil matter and not a material planning consideration. Such negotiations are out with the remit of the planning authority. Ultimately, it's considered to be for the developer to address the conditions of the planning permission and for owners to collaborate at time of purchase to agree means of delivering the upgrading of the access road. Some observations. The application is offering to enter into Section 75. The decision notice has to be issued and development has been issued and development has commenced. Also, it's possible for members to delete the condition on the speculative hope that an agreement will be reached afterwards. What happens if the applicant does not agree with the terms? If the contribution, the cost of which might be given back, right? There's no commitment. There's no commitment or involvement from other parties to the road, to upgrading the access. And this not yeah, and this is noted. And there's a note. There's also the precision of the wording question, which was brought up with the applicant. Condition 6 is met by the actually met by the submission of information and doesn't require the works to be carried out. Now this, the work that's to be carried out is also required by roads construction consent. There's a bit of double handling here with the roads department of the council. The applicant's 2018 application shows detailed plans and specifications for the access road. So that condition 6 can be said to have met by the submission of those plans, regardless of whether they are implemented. That's a slightly muddled presentation. I apologise for that. As I apologise for the lack of any up-to-date photographs. That's my complete presentation, though, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. This was obviously a deferred case. So I'm going to ask Mr. Elliott if he could clarify the situation now. Let's come back to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Members, first I'm going to turn to the minutes of the meeting when this was first called. I do have it written down myself. I know it's not before you, but first of all, it's a technical issue. The minutes of the previous meeting do indicate that it was deferred for an unaccompanied site visit. Now, I'm aware that hasn't taken place, but committee services, those sitting next to me, Mr. Williams, reviewed the footage, and in fact, it turns out that's an error. It was not requested an unaccompanied site visit. So that, just to be clear, although it's in the minutes, it hasn't taken place. It wasn't technically ordered. There was an error in the minutes. However, I would make it clear that today it is an option open to you should you wish to defer for a site visit. Now, turning to the other aspect of the deferral, I'm going to read out what I understand to be the deferral before and then give you an update on that. I think Councillor James was present last time at the previous meeting, but there's no one else here that was present last time, including myself. I was not present at last meeting. Now, members, this review was deferred and there was an instruction to legal and planning advisors to undertake an investigation into the potential remedies for the adoption or upgrading of the access and to better understand the applicant's submission as regards concluding a legal agreement to secure the upgrading of the access road. Such investigation is to consider such matters as the construction specification for the road, ownership and rights of usage, the financial mechanism and phasing for the upgrading and the potential for any agreement as to the future maintenance of the road by interested parties. Now, members, I wasn't the legal advisor at the time, but the legal advisor who was present, the legal manager, I've had a kind of quick email update from him, which I appreciate is not before you, which can have its relevance. But my understanding is there were internal discussions and the position of transport planning has now changed from essentially one of disagreeing and objecting to this to one of agreeing and not opposing this. I fully appreciate, however, I am just giving you an oral update. An option available to you would be to defer, and I appreciate deferral would take time, but to defer for an updated written information from transport planning. Of course, there's the question of whether we have an update of view from development management. The applicant can always comment in terms of the LRB rules. The applicant can always comment anyway. But just to give you an update, the full terms of the deferral I've read out, and while we don't have anything in front of you, the update is my understanding. Transport planning's position has completely changed the opposite way. Admittedly, that's an oral update. I don't have that in writing.
Just to clarify then, we're saying that transport planning have no objection to the removal of this condition now. Is that what we're...
I had it in writing from the legal manager, but I don't have anything in writing from transport planning, so it's coming through third hand, if you like. I've no reason to doubt it. However, you don't have that in writing before you.
On that basis, I think my thoughts would be that we do defer this until we get that in writing. I know the applicants are probably frustrated at another deferment, but the indications are in their favour, and I think they would be happy for that deferment to take place while we await that confirmation in writing. But I will allow my colleagues to comment if they wish. If they wish, are they happy to concur with me, or if they wish to go a different way? But Councillor James, are you happy to defer pending in writing?
I think the rules of local review body is if one person requests a deferment, then that's the right of the.
Yeah, you're quite right, Councillor James. Yes, so I think we will go for a deferment pending the in writing confirmation.
I wouldn't quite put it at the level of a rule, but it's certainly the practice of the local review body, because it means that one member is not satisfied in taking it and being able to take a decision at the moment, and therefore the logic is that it is deferred. But I just want to be clear. I mean, obviously you've not referred to Councillor Anderson yet because of the kind of that general practice, but I want to be clear what the terms would be. There is a benefit in deferring. I appreciate the applicant may not wish it and would want a decision ASAP. But a benefit that does not need to be minuted is that Mr. Burton would be able to visit the site and take updated photographs for the next meeting. But strictly speaking, that doesn't need to be minuted. That's what Mr. Burton can do himself. But I want to be clear, it would be defer for further written information from Transport Planning on their updated position on the review application. I think the question is whether you want development management to comment on that or whether you're just simply looking for the transport planning update.
I think if development management comment as well would help, yeah.
So defer for further information, further written information from transport planning on their updated position on the review application, development management to comment on that, and thirdly to back to the local review body. There's no need to specify that the applicant can comment on it because that's under the LRB rules anyway. Does that cover the deferral?
That's fine by me, yeah. Fine, so that now brings us to the end of this meeting this morning. Before we close, I would like to add a couple of comments. First of all, I know my two colleagues have brought up a comment that we seem to now be having applications coming through without visits by planning officers, and I think given the COVID situation has now passed us, I would perhaps like to ask if planning officers could now perhaps start to visit application sites as a matter of course, rather than the norm being just to rely on digital information. I think it would help in many ways if they were to visit as they did in the past. Now the pandemic emergency has now passed us by, or seems to have passed us by anyway. The second comment is, as you may recall when I started, I mentioned we had two members of committee services with us this morning, which was an unusual circumstance. And the reason was that we are now aware that Mr. Danny Williams is departing the planning side of the service and going to work for another committee. Why, of course, I have no idea. The excitement of planning and the LRB must be an immediate draw to anybody. As the man always said, anything can happen in the next half hour, and that's very true of planning. But I would like to take this opportunity to thank Danny for all the work he has done. Councillor Anderson has only known him for a short period of time since returning after the election. Councillor James and I have known him for the last 5 years, both through our work on the LRB and, of course, our work on planning. And of course, Danny works not just for this particular body, but for the planning committee as well, which is a difficult task, I'm sure, at the best of times with all the paperwork. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank him for all his work in the last 5 years in supporting us on the LRB when Councillor James and I have served on it, and many occasions we've served on it. And of course, as Vice Convener of Planning in the last session, again, to thank him for all his work and diligence in helping our committees function. It would also be remiss of me not to mention Jess Gills, who's taken over from him, to welcome her. The bar is set very high. No pressure, of course, but that's the way it is. So congratulations for coming onto the committee. I hope you enjoy it. We're a pretty easygoing bunch on the LRB. The planning committee is much more difficult, I think, with 15 members now. But I welcome you to it, and good luck in the future for you. But finally, again, thank you.